The island was serene, the lagoon calm and inviting as I swam. Then the reef below grew darker, the shadows shifting unnaturally. A sleek form appeared, its movements deliberate and terrifying. Before I could reach the shore, it attacked with lethal force. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start with today's shark attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from. Click the like button, and let's get into the story. The pre-dawn darkness cloaked Cape Hatteras in a veil of quiet anticipation. Jack Miller, a weathered fisherman of 43 years, stood at the edge of the marina, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The aroma of salt and diesel fuel mingled in the air, a familiar scent that had long ago seeped into his very pores. Jack took a long sip, savoring the bitter warmth as his eyes scanned the horizon. The sky was beginning to lighten, a faint purple hue bleeding into the inky blackness. Promised to be a beautiful day, perfect for fishing. He couldn't shake the feeling of excitement that always preceded a day out on the water. As he made his way down the dock, the wooden planks creaked beneath his feet, a symphony of age and use. His boat, the Sarah's Grace, named after his wife, bobbed gently in its slip. It wasn't much to look at a 24-foot center console that had seen better days, but it was his pride and joy. Jack began his pre-trip routine, checking the fuel levels and ensuring all his gear was in order. As he worked, he heard familiar footsteps approaching. "Mornin', Jack," came a gruff voice. "Headed out early today, huh?" Jack looked up to see Tom Henderson, a fellow fisherman and longtime friend, ambling down the dock. "Morning, Tom," Jack replied with a nod. "Yeah, figured I'd get an early start. The mackerel should be running good this time of year." Tom leaned against a nearby piling, his own mug of coffee in hand. "Heard anything about those shark sightings from last week?" Jack paused in his work, a slight frown creasing his brow. "Yeah, I heard some chatter. Couple of surfers claimed they saw a big one out past the breakers. Probably just exaggerating, you know how it is." Tom nodded solemnly. "Maybe so, but Billy swears he saw one yesterday. Said it was bigger than his boat." "Dilly's been known to tell a tall tale or two," Jack chuckled, but there was a hint of unease in his voice. "Besides, the sharks are always out there. It's their home after all." "True enough," Tom conceded. "Just be careful out there, all right? Sarah would have my hide if anything happened to you on my watch." Jack smiled at the mention of his wife. "Speaking of Sarah, I better finish up here before she comes down to try and talk me out of going." As if on cue, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the dock. Jack turned to see Sarah approaching, her blonde hair whipping in the early morning breeze. She was still in her pajamas, a worried expression etched on her face. "Jack Miller, were you really going to leave without saying goodbye?" she called out, her voice a mixture of exasperation and concern. Jack set down his tackle box and met her halfway, enveloping her in a warm embrace. "Of course not, sweetheart. I was just getting everything ready." Sarah pulled back, her blue eyes searching his face. "I don't like this, Jack. Not with all the shark sightings lately. Can't you wait a few days? Or at least go out with Tom or one of the other guys?" Jack sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "Sarah, we've been through this. The bills won't pay themselves, and the fishing's been good lately. We need this." I know," Sarah replied, her voice softening. "It's just, I can't shake this feeling. Promise me you'll be careful." Jack cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "I promise, love. I'll be back before you know it, with a boat full of fish and not a scratch on me." Sarah managed a small smile, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. "All right, but if you're not back by sundown, I'm sending out a search party." "Deal," Jack chuckled, placing a soft kiss on her forehead. "Now go on back to bed. I'll see you this evening." As Sarah reluctantly made her way back up the dock, Tom approached Jack once more. "She's right to worry, you know. Maybe you should take someone with you." just in case. Jack shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "I'll be fine, Tom. Been fishing these waters since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Besides, someone needs to stay behind and keep an eye on things here." Tom nodded, knowing better than to argue. "All right then. Good luck out there, and keep your eyes peeled." With a final wave to Tom and a glance back at Sarah's retreating figure, Jack climbed aboard the Sarah's Grace. The engine sputtered to life, its familiar rumble a comfort in the growing light of dawn. As he steered the boat out of the marina and into the open water, Jack couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. The ocean stretched out before him, a vast expanse of possibility and danger. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. It was a sight that never failed to take Jack's breath away, no matter how many times he'd seen it. As he navigated through the gentle swells, Jack's mind wandered to the shark sightings. It wasn't uncommon to see sharks in these waters, especially this time of year. But the frequency of the recent sightings was unusual, and the reported size of the sharks was concerning. Jack shook his head, trying to dispel the nagging worry. He was being foolish, letting idle gossip get to him. He'd been fishing these waters for decades and had never had any serious trouble with sharks. Sure, he'd seen them from time to time, but they'd always kept their distance. Still, as he cut the engine and prepared to drop anchor at his favorite fishing spot, Jack found himself scanning the water more carefully than usual. The surface was calm, betraying nothing of what might lurk beneath. "Get a grip, old man," Jack muttered to himself as he baited his hook. "You're letting Sarah's worry get to you." He cast his line out, the familiar whistle of the fishing lines slicing through the air bringing a smile to his face. This was where he belonged, out on the open water with nothing but the sky above and the sea below. As the morning wore on, Jack fell into the rhythm of fishing. The gentle rocking of the boat, the occasional tug on his line, the cry of seagulls overhead, it all blended into a soothing symphony that calmed his earlier nerves. By midday, Jack had a respectable catch in his cooler. The sun beat down overhead, and he wiped the sweat from his brow, considering whether to call it a day. That's when he noticed something odd. The water around his boat had become eerily still. The usual sounds of lapping waves and distant boat engines seemed muffled, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He scanned the water, his heart rate quickening. At first, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then, about 50 yards out, he caught a glimpse of something breaking the surface. So, Jack's breath caught in his throat. Could be a dolphin, he told himself. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The fin was too large, too sharp. As he watched, frozen in place, the fin began to move. It was heading straight for his boat. "Oh God," Jack whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating in an instant. He scrambled to pull up his anchor, his hands shaking as he worked. The fin disappeared beneath the surface, but Jack knew the danger was far from over. As he reached for the ignition, a massive form passed beneath his boat, its shadow visible even in the sun-dappled water. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, Sarah's worried face flashing in his mind. "I should have listened," he muttered, turning the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, but refused to start. Below? Low? Below. Not now. The water around the boat began to churn, and Jack knew he was out of time. As he desperately tried to restart the engine, he caught sight of a massive, dark shape rising from the depths. The last thing Jack saw before his world turned upside down was a pair of cold, black eyes and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. The calm before the storm had passed. The true horror was about to begin. Jack's boat glided smoothly over the gentle swells, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the water. He'd been out for a couple of hours now, the coastline of Cape Hatteras a distant smudge on the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of salt and fish, a smell that never failed to invigorate him. As he cut the engine, allowing the boat to drift, Jack surveyed his surroundings. The water stretched endlessly in every direction, a deep blue expanse that seemed to hold infinite possibilities. This was his element, the place where he felt most alive. "All right, old girl," Jack murmured to his boat, patting the worn railing affectionately. "Let's see what we can catch today." He reached for his favorite rod, a sturdy piece that had seen him through countless fishing trips. With practiced ease, he baited the hook and cast his line out into the water. The familiar whistle of the line and the soft plop as it hit the surface brought a smile to his weathered face. For a while, Jack fished in contented silence, occasionally reeling in a decent-sized catch. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat becoming more intense. Wiping the sweat from his brow, Jack reached for his water bottle, taking a long swig. That's when he noticed it. A subtle change in the water's movement, a shift in the current that seemed out of place. Jack's eyes narrowed as he scanned the surrounding area. Years of experience had honed his instincts, and right now those instincts were telling him something was off. "What's going on out there?" he muttered to himself, leaning over the side of the boat for a better look. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, about 50 yards out, he caught a glimpse of something large moving beneath the surface. His heart rate quickened. Could be a school of fish, he told himself, or maybe a dolphin. But deep down, he knew it was neither. Jack's mind raced back to the conversation at the dock earlier that morning. The shark sightings, the warnings from Tom and Sarah. He dismissed them then, confident in his experience and knowledge of these waters. Now, faced with the reality of what might be lurking beneath the surface, the confidence began to waver. "Keep it together, Jack," he said aloud, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the water. "You've dealt with sharks before. It's probably just passing through." Even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. This was different. The shadow he'd seen was massive, far larger than any shark he'd encountered in his decades of fishing these waters. Jack's hand moved instinctively towards the radio mounted on the boat's console. He hesitated, his pride warring with his growing sense of unease. Calling for help now might make him look foolish if it turned out to be nothing. But if it wasn't nothing, before he could make a decision, his fishing line suddenly went taut. The rod bent alarmingly, nearly yanked from his grasp by the force of whatever was on the other end. "Jesus!" Jack exclaimed, grabbing the rod with both hands. His muscles strained as he fought to maintain his grip. This was no ordinary catch. The line zinged as it was pulled out at an alarming rate. Jack's hands moved automatically, adjusting the drag, trying to slow whatever mammoth creature he'd hooked. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his arms burning with the effort. Come on," he grunted, fighting to regain control of the situation. For several intense minutes, Jack battled with his unseen opponent. The boat rocked dangerously as he was pulled from one side to the other. Just when he thought his arms couldn't take any more, the pressure suddenly eased. Jack blinked in surprise, momentarily off balance from the abrupt change. He began to reel in the slack, his mind racing. Had the fish gotten away? Had the line snapped? That's when he saw it. A dorsal fin, darker than the surrounding water, cutting through the surface like a knife. It was heading straight for his boat. "Oh God," Jack breathed, his earlier bravado evaporating in an instant. The fin disappeared beneath the surface, but Jack knew the danger was far from over. He could see the massive shape moving beneath his boat, far larger than he'd initially realized. His little fishing boat suddenly felt terribly inadequate. Jack's hands shook as he reached for the ignition key. The engine sputtered to life, but before he could put the boat in gear, something rammed into the hull with tremendous force. The impact nearly knocked him off his feet. No, Jack muttered, desperately trying to maintain his balance as the boat rocked violently. Another powerful hit from below sent a shudder through the entire vessel. Jack could hear the ominous sound of wood splintering. Water began to seep in through a crack in the hull. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but years of experience on the water kicked in. Jack knew he needed to radio for help. He lunged for the console, his fingers fumbling with the dial. "Mayday, mayday. This is the Sarah's Grace," he shouted into the receiver, his voice cracking with urgency. "I'm approximately 10 miles east of Cape Hatteras. I'm under attack by a large shark. My boat is taking on water. I need immediate assistance." He repeated the message, praying that someone would hear him. The radio crackled with static, offering no immediate response. Another bone-jarring impact rocked the boat. Jack lost his footing, slamming hard against the side of the console. Pain exploded in his ribs, and he tasted blood in his mouth. As he struggled to his feet, he caught sight of the shark. It had surfaced near the boat, its massive body easily dwarfing the Sarah's Grace. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he took in the creature's size. It had to be at least 20 feet long, possibly more. Its skin was a mottled gray, scarred from countless battles. But it was the eyes that truly terrified Jack. Cold, black, and utterly devoid of emotion. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Jack locked eyes with the prehistoric predator. In that instant, he understood with chilling clarity that he was no longer the hunter. He was prey. The shark's massive tail propelled it forward, its mouth opening to reveal rows of serrated teeth. Jack had just enough time to dive to the other side of the boat before the shark's powerful jaws clamped down on the spot where he'd been standing. With splintered and metal groaned as the shark thrashed, its teeth tearing into the boat's structure. Water poured in through the new gaps, and Jack realized with growing horror that the Sarah's Grace was going down. He scrambled to release the life raft, his hands slipping on the wet surfaces. The boat was listing heavily now, the deck angling sharply as more water flooded in. Come on, Jack muttered, finally managing to inflate the small raft. Just as he was about to climb in, the shark attacked again. Its massive body slammed into the already damaged hull, and this time, the boat couldn't take it. With a sickening crack, the Sarah's Grace split apart. Jack was thrown into the water, the shock of the cold stealing his breath. He thrashed wildly, desperate to reach the surface. As he broke through, gasping for air, he saw the remains of his beloved boat sinking beneath the waves. The life raft had been thrown clear in the chaos. Jack began to swim towards it, his strokes fueled by pure adrenaline. He could feel the vast presence of the shark somewhere beneath him, circling, waiting. With a final burst of energy, Jack reached the raft and hauled himself in. He lay there for a moment, chest heaving, limbs trembling from exertion and fear. But he knew he couldn't rest. Not yet, not with the shark still out there. Slowly, Jack sat up, his eyes scanning the water around him. The surface was calm now, deceptively peaceful. But he knew better. Somewhere out there, in the deep blue depths, the shark was waiting. As the full gravity of his situation settled over him, Jack felt a wave of despair threaten to overwhelm him. He was stranded in open water, miles from shore, with a monstrous predator circling beneath him. His only hope was that someone had heard his distress call. "I should have listened to you, Sarah," he whispered, his wife's worried face flashing in his mind. A shadow passed beneath the raft, reminding Jack that his ordeal was far from over. The shark was still there, patient and persistent, and Jack knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that it wasn't going to give up easily. As he huddled in the small raft, Jack prepared himself for the longest wait of his life. The sun beat down mercilessly from above. The vast ocean stretched endlessly around him, and somewhere below, a prehistoric predator bided its time. The real test of survival had only just begun. The sun hung high in a cloudless sky, its merciless rays beating down on Jack as he clung to the small life raft. Hours had passed since the Sarah's Grace had been torn apart, leaving him stranded in the vast expanse of the Atlantic. The initial adrenaline rush had long since faded, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and gnawing fear. Jack's eyes burned from constantly scanning the water around him. The ocean's surface remained deceptively calm, betraying nothing of the danger that lurked beneath. But he knew it was there, waiting, watching. "Come on," Jack muttered, his voice hoarse from thirst. Someone must have heard the mayday. He squinted at the horizon, searching for any sign of an approaching boat or helicopter. But there was nothing, just endless blue in every direction. The raft bobbed gently on the swells, each motion sending a jolt of pain through Jack's bruised ribs. He winced, gingerly touching his side. The adrenaline had masked the worst of it earlier, but now the pain was a constant, throbbing reminder of his brush with death. As another hour crawled by, Jack's mind began to wander. He thought of Sarah, imagining her pacing their small kitchen, checking the clock every few minutes. Would she have alerted the Coast Guard by now? Or was she still holding on to hope that he was just running late? A shadow passed beneath the raft, snapping Jack back to his dire reality. His heart rate spiked, hands gripping the sides of the raft so hard his knuckles turned white. "Just pass on by," he whispered, a desperate prayer to any deity that might be listening. "There's nothing for you here." For a moment, it seemed his plea had been heard. The shadow moved on, disappearing into the depths. Jack let out a shaky breath, allowing himself to relax just a fraction. That's when it happened. With a surge of water that nearly capsized the small raft, a massive form breached the surface mere feet away. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he found himself face to face with the stuff of nightmares. The tiger shark was even larger than he'd initially thought. At least 20 feet long, its body was a study in primal power. Scars crisscrossed its gray hide, testament to countless battles won. But it was the eyes that truly terrified Jack. Black, emotionless orbs that regarded him with ancient, implacable hunger. "Jesus Christ," Jack breathed, unable to look away from those terrible eyes. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and prey locked gazes. Then, with a powerful flick of its tail, the shark submerged once more. Jack's heart hammered in his chest, threatening to burst through his ribcage. He knew with chilling certainty that the next attack would come soon. The shark had sized up its prey. Now he would move in for the kill. As if summoned by his thoughts, the massive dorsal fin cut through the water, circling the raft. Each pass brought it closer, like a noose slowly tightening. Jack's mind raced, searching for any way out of this nightmare. He had no weapon, no means of defending himself against such a formidable predator. All he had was this fragile raft and his own determination to survive. "Sink, damn it," he growled, forcing his panic-stricken mind to focus. He remembered reading once that sharks were sensitive to electrical impulses, that a sharp blow to the nose could sometimes drive them off. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. The circling fin disappeared beneath the surface. Jack tensed, knowing the attack was imminent. Seconds ticked by, each one in agony of anticipation. Suddenly, the raft jolted violently. Jack barely managed to keep his balance as the shark rammed it from below. "Come on, you bastard," Jack shouted, a mix of terror and defiance in his voice. "Is that all you've got?" As if in answer, the shark struck again. This time, Jack wasn't so lucky. The impact threw him from the raft, plunging him into the cold embrace of the Atlantic. Panic threatened to overwhelm him as he thrashed in the water. Every instinct screamed at him to swim, to get back to the relative safety of the raft. But a lifetime of experience on the water kicked in, overriding his fear. "Don't splash," he told himself, forcing his movements to become slow and deliberate. "Don't act like prey." He turned in the water, trying to spot the shark. The sun's glare on the surface made it difficult to see beneath the waves. Jack's heart pounded in his ears, every sense straining for any sign of the approaching predator. A flicker of movement caught his eye. The shark was coming straight at him, its massive jaws opening wide. Time seemed to slow. Jack could see every detail with horrifying clarity. The rows of serrated teeth, each as long as his finger. The deep, black maw that promised only death. In that moment, a strange calm settled over Jack. If this was to be his end, he would meet it fighting. As the shark closed the final distance, Jack summoned every ounce of strength he had left. With a primal yell that tore from his throat, he swung his fist with all his might, connecting solidly with the shark's sensitive snout. The impact sent a jolt of pain up Jack's arm, but he barely noticed. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, miraculously, the shark veered off at the last second, its huge body brushing past Jack with enough force to spin him in the water. Jack didn't waste a second. He swam for the raft with desperate strokes, expecting at any moment to feel the shark's jaws close around him. By some miracle, he reached the raft unmolested, hauling himself aboard with trembling arms. Gasping for breath, Jack collapsed in the bottom of the raft. His entire body shook with exhaustion and residual terror. But he was alive, for now. As his breathing slowly returned to normal, Jack cautiously peered over the side of the raft. The shark's fin had reappeared, but it was keeping its distance now, circling, waiting. "That's right," Jack muttered, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not going down easy." But even as a small spark of hope flickered in his chest, Jack knew the reprieve was temporary. The shark was still out there, and it was far from giving up. This was its domain, and it had all the time in the world. As the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, Jack settled in for a long, tense night. His encounter with the shark had left him battered and exhausted, but also with a renewed determination to survive. He thought of Sarah again, of the life they had built together. He thought of the fishing trips with his father that had sparked his love for the sea. He thought of all the things he still wanted to do, the places he wanted to see. "I'm not done yet," Jack said softly, his words carried away by the salt-laden breeze. "You hear me? I'm not done." The shark's fins sliced through the water in silent response, a reminder that the battle was far from over. As darkness began to fall, turning the ocean into a vast, unknowable void, Jack steeled himself for what was to come. The first encounter had ended in a stalemate, but Jack knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that the shark would be back. And next time, a lucky punch might not be enough to save him. As night settled over the Atlantic, predator and prey prepared for the next round in their deadly game of survival. The ocean, vast and indifferent, bore silent witness to the struggle, its gentle waves hiding the terror that lurked beneath the surface. The night had passed in a haze of fitful dozing and constant vigilance for Jack. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, he found himself still adrift, his small life raft the only barrier between him and the depths below. Jack's body ached from the cramped conditions and the lingering effects of yesterday's encounter. His throat was parched, lips cracked from dehydration. But he was alive, and that was something. "Made it through the night," he muttered, his voice rough. "Now let's see about getting out of this mess." As the sun climbed higher, Jack scanned the horizon once more, hoping against hope to see a ship or plane. But the vast expanse of the Atlantic remained empty, indifferent to his plight. The shark had maintained its vigil throughout the night, its fin breaking the surface at irregular intervals, a constant reminder of the danger lurking below. Now, in the growing light of day, Jack could see it more clearly. The massive predator circled the raft, its movements slow and deliberate. "You're a patient one, aren't you?" Jack said, watching the shark's methodical patrol. "Well, so am I. I've got people waiting for me back home." As if in response to his words, the shark suddenly changed course, heading directly for the raft. Jack tensed, gripping the sides of the small vessel. The impact, when it came, nearly capsized the raft. Jack was thrown to one side, barely managing to keep from going overboard. Water sloshed over the sides, soaking him and making the floor of the raft treacherously slippery. "Damn it!" Jack yelled, scrambling to right himself. Before he could fully regain his balance, the shark struck again. This time, its massive body collided with the underside of the raft, lifting it partially out of the water. For a heart-stopping moment, Jack felt weightless, suspended in midair. Then gravity reasserted itself. The raft came crashing back down, the impact jarring every bone in Jack's body. He cried out in pain as his already bruised ribs protested the rough treatment. "Come on, come on," Jack muttered, frantically trying to spot the shark. "Where are you?" A dark shadow passed beneath the raft, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. The shark was positioning itself for another attack. Time seemed to slow as Jack watched the massive predator rise from the depths, its jaws opening wide. In that moment, he knew with terrifying certainty that the raft wouldn't withstand another hit. "No choice," he gasped, making a split-second decision. Just as the shark was about to strike, Jack dove from the raft. He hit the water hard, the cold shocking his system. Disoriented, he kicked desperately, trying to get his bearings. The shark, caught off guard by its prey's sudden movement, overshot its mark. Its powerful body collided with the empty raft, the force of the impact flipping it over. Jack surfaced, gasping for air. He found himself face to face with the upturned bottom of the raft. Without hesitation, he swam towards it, knowing it was his only chance for survival. Come on," he panted, pushing his exhausted body to its limits. He reached the overturned raft just as he felt a massive presence pass beneath him. Panic gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. With a Herculean effort, Jack hauled himself onto the slick surface of the upturned raft. For a moment, he lay there, chest heaving, every muscle screaming in protest. But he knew he couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. Carefully, he turned over, scanning the water around him. The shark's fin cut through the surface about 20 yards away, circling back for another pass. "All right, you son of a bitch," Jack growled, a mixture of fear and determination in his voice. "You want to dance? Let's dance." As the shark approached, Jack tensed, ready to move at a moment's notice. He knew he was in an even more precarious position now. The smooth bottom of the raft offered little purchase, and one wrong move could send him sliding back into the water. The shark's attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. It rammed the raft from below, the impact nearly dislodging Jack. He clung desperately to the edges, his fingers scrabbling for purchase on the slick surface. "No," Jack shouted, more in defiance than fear. "I'm not going down that easy." But the shark was relentless. It circled back, this time aiming for the edge of the raft. Jack saw it coming and tried to shift his weight to the opposite side, but he was too slow. The shark's powerful jaws clamped down on the edge of the raft, its serrated teeth easily puncturing the tough material. With a violent shake of its massive head, it tore a chunk away. Water began to pour in through the gaping hole. Jack watched in horror as his tiny refuge began to sink beneath him. "No, no, no," he muttered, desperation clawing at him. The raft was going down fast. In a matter of seconds, it would be completely submerged, leaving Jack with nowhere to go but into the waiting jaws of the shark. Time seemed to slow as Jack weighed his options. He could stay with the sinking raft, hoping against hope that it would provide some protection. Or he could make a break for it, swimming for... What? There was nowhere to go. No safety to be found in the vast, empty ocean. The decision was taken out of his hands as the shark struck again. This time, its massive body collided with what remained of the raft, sending Jack flying. He hit the water hard, the impact driving what little air remained from his lungs. Disoriented, he kicked frantically, fighting to reach the surface. As his head broke through, Jack gasped, sucking in great lungfuls of air. His eyes darted around, searching for the shark. For a moment he saw nothing. Then, about 10 yards away, he spotted the telltale dorsal fin cutting through the water. It was coming straight for him. "Come on, Jack," he said to himself, treading water. Think. His mind raced, recalling everything he knew about shark behavior. They were attracted to erratic movements, to the thrashing of wounded prey. If he panicked now, he was as good as dead. Taking a deep breath, Jack forced himself to remain as still as possible. He spread his arms wide, trying to make himself look bigger, less like easy prey. The shark closed the distance rapidly. Jack could see its dark shape beneath the surface, growing larger by the second. His heart hammered in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to swim, to flee. But he held his ground. As the shark drew near, Jack prepared himself. He knew he would only get one chance at this. If he mistimed it, if his strength failed him for even a second, it would all be over. The shark's snout broke the surface, its black eyes fixed on Jack with predatory intensity. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. Jack could see every detail of the massive creature, the scars on its rough hide, the rows of serrated teeth visible in its slightly open mouth. With a surge of adrenaline, Jack acted. As the shark lunged forward, jaws opening wide, he brought his hand down with all his might, striking the sensitive area near its eye. The impact sent a jolt of pain up Jack's arm, but he barely noticed. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, incredibly, the shark veered off course, its massive body brushing past Jack with enough force to spin him in the water. Jack didn't waste a second. He began to swim, powerful strokes carrying him away from the momentarily stunned predator. His muscles burned with the effort, but fear and desperation lent him strength he didn't know he possessed. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a minute or two, Jack paused, treading water as he looked back. The shark was nowhere to be seen, but he knew better than to believe it had given up. As if summoned by his thoughts, the dorsal fin reappeared, cutting through the water some distance away. It was circling again, wary now of its surprisingly resilient prey. Jack allowed himself a grim smile. "That's right," he muttered. "I'm not going down without a fight." But even as a small spark of hope flickered in his chest, Jack knew his situation was dire. He was alone in the open ocean, with no raft, no supplies, and a determined predator still hunting him. His only hope now was rescue, and with each passing hour, that hope grew dimmer. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jack settled in for the longest wait of his life. The shark continued its patient circling, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beneath the surface. And somewhere beyond the horizon, unaware of the life and death struggle playing out in the vast Atlantic, the world went on turning. The merciless sun beat down on Jack as he treaded water, his muscles burning with exhaustion. Hours had passed since the shark had destroyed his life raft, leaving him completely exposed in the vast expanse of the Atlantic. His throat was parched, lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration, but still he fought on. "Just keep moving," Jack muttered to himself, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. "Sarah's waiting. You promised her you'd come home." The thought of his wife gave him a momentary surge of strength. He pictured her face, worried but hopeful, waiting by the phone for news. He couldn't give up. Not now. The shark had maintained its vigil throughout the day, its fin breaking the surface at irregular intervals. Sometimes it would disappear for long stretches, only to suddenly reappear alarmingly close. Each time, Jack's heart would race, adrenaline flooding his system. As the afternoon wore on, Jack's movements became slower, more labored. His limbs felt like lead, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep his head above water. He knew he was reaching his limits. "Come on," he growled, forcing his arms to keep moving. "You've survived worse than this." But even as he said it, Jack knew it wasn't true. In all his years on the water, he'd never faced anything like this. The relentless sun, the endless ocean, and the constant, lurking presence of the shark were wearing him down, body and soul. Suddenly, Jack felt something brush against his leg underwater. His breath caught in his throat, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. "No," he whispered, eyes wide with terror. "Not now, not like this." He kicked frantically, trying to put some distance between himself and whatever had touched him. But in his exhausted state, his movements were slow, uncoordinated. The shark's fin cut through the water barely 10 feet away, heading straight for him. Jack could see its massive form just beneath the surface, a dark shadow of impending doom. Time seemed to slow as Jack watched the shark approach. He knew he should move, should fight, but his body refused to respond. Exhaustion and fear had finally overwhelmed him. As the shark closed the final distance, its huge jaws opening wide, Jack closed his eyes. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered. The impact, when it came, was like being hit by a truck. Jack felt himself being lifted out of the water, the shark's powerful jaws clamping down on his right thigh. Pain exploded through his body, a scream tearing from his throat. "Lo!" Jack roared, a primal sound of pain and defiance. In that moment, survival instinct overrode everything else. With strength born of desperation, Jack brought his fists down on the shark's sensitive nose. Again and again, the shark thrashed violently, its teeth tearing deeper into Jack's flesh. The water around them turned red with blood. Jack could feel himself being pulled under, the shark attempting to drag its prey into the depths. "Not like this," Jack gasped between blows, each word punctuated by another strike to the shark's snout. Suddenly, miraculously, the pressure on his leg eased. The shark, stunned by the unexpected resistance, released its grip. Jack felt himself falling back into the water. He surfaced, gasping and choking. The pain in his leg was excruciating, but he forced himself to focus. The shark was still there, circling, its dorsal fin cutting through the bloodied water. Jack knew he had only moments before it attacked again. He had to act fast. With trembling hands, he tore off his shirt, quickly fashioning it into a makeshift tourniquet. He wrapped it tightly around his thigh, just above the wound, biting back a scream as he pulled it as tight as he could. Come on," he muttered, his vision blurring from pain and blood loss. The shark was coming back, drawn by the scent of blood in the water. Jack could see its dark shape approaching beneath the surface. In a desperate move, Jack dove under, pushing through the pain in his leg. He swam directly towards the shark, catching it off guard. As they drew close, Jack lashed out with all his remaining strength, his fist connecting solidly with the shark's gill slits. The shark recoiled, more from surprise than pain. It veered off course, circling around for another pass. Jack surfaced, doping in air. He knew he couldn't keep this up for long. The blood loss was making him dizzy, and each movement sent waves of agony through his injured leg. "Help!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Somebody help me!" But there was no one to hear his cries, just the endless ocean, the circling shark, and the indifferent sky above. As the shark came around for another attack, Jack steeled himself. He spread his arms wide, trying to make himself look bigger, less like easy prey. It was a desperate move, but he was out of options. The shark closed in, its black eyes fixed on Jack with predatory intensity. Time seemed to slow as predator and prey faced off once more. Just as the shark was about to strike, a sound cut through the air. A distant whump 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 that Jack recognized immediately. A helicopter, he breathed, hopes surging through him. The shark, startled by the unfamiliar noise, hesitated in its attack. It circled once more, then dove deep, disappearing from sight. Jack looked up, squinting against the sun. There, on the horizon, he could just make out the shape of an approaching helicopter. "Here!" he shouted, waving his arms frantically. "I'm here." As the helicopter drew closer, Jack felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. Tears mingled with the salt water on his face as he realized that his ordeal might finally be coming to an end. The helicopter hovered overhead, its downdraft whipping the water into a frenzy. Jack could see a Coast Guard diver preparing to jump. "You're going to be okay, sir," the diver shouted as he hit the water. "We've got you." As the diver swam towards him, Jack finally allowed himself to relax. The adrenaline that had kept him going for so long began to ebb, and with it came a crushing wave of exhaustion and pain. "The shark," Jack managed to say as the diver reached him. "It's still out there." "Don't worry about that now," the diver replied, securing a rescue harness around Jack. "Let's get you out of here." As they were winched up towards the helicopter, Jack looked down at the ocean below. The water was calm now, betraying nothing of the terror that lurked beneath its surface. Somewhere down there, the shark was still circling, perhaps already seeking its next prey. Inside the helicopter, medical personnel immediately began tending to Jack's leg. As they Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "I didn't think I was going to make it." One of the medics patted his shoulder. "You're tougher than you look, old man. Not many people could have survived what you just went through." As the helicopter turned towards shore, Jack closed his eyes. He thought of Sarah, of the life that had nearly been taken from him. He thought of the shark, still out there in the vast ocean. And he knew with absolute certainty that he would never look at the sea the same way again. The struggle for survival was over, but Jack understood that the real challenge was just beginning. The physical wounds would heal, but the memory of those terrifying hours in the water would stay with him forever. As the coastline came into view, Jack steeled himself for the long road to recovery that lay ahead. The rhythmic thump of the helicopter's blades filled Jack's ears as he lay strapped to a stretcher, his body a canvas of pain and exhaustion. The adrenaline that had kept him alive in the water was fading fast, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that threatened to pull him into unconsciousness. But Jack fought to stay awake, clinging to awareness with the same tenacity that had kept him alive in the ocean. "Stay with us, Mr. Miller." A voice cut through the haze of pain. It was one of the Coast Guard medics, her face a mask of concentration as she worked on his mangled leg. "We're almost to the hospital." Jack tried to nod, but even that small movement sent waves of agony through his body. He gritted his teeth, tasting blood and salt. "Sarah," he managed to croak, his voice barely audible over the helicopter's noise. "My wife. She needs to know." The medic's eyes softened for a moment. "Don't worry, sir. We've already contacted your family. They'll be waiting for you at the hospital." Relief washed over Jack, bringing with it a fresh wave of exhaustion. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment, he told himself, "Mr. Miller, Jack, I need you to stay awake." The medic's voice was sharp now, urgent. "Your blood pressure is dropping. We can't have you passing out on us." Jack forced his eyes open, focusing on the medic's face. She looked young, probably not much older than his own daughter, but her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had seen their share of emergencies. "That's it. Keep those eyes open," she encouraged. "Tell me about your wife. Sarah, right? What does she do?" Jack licked his cracked lips, grateful for the distraction. She's a teacher, 3rd grade. The kids, they love her." "I bet they do." The medic smiled, her hands never stopping their work. "You two been married long?" 25 years. Jack managed a weak smile. "Anniversary. Next month." "Well, we'll make sure you're there to celebrate it," the medic assured him. "You've got a heck of a story to tell her now." Jack's mind drifted back to the water, to the terrifying moments when he thought he'd never see Sarah again. The memory of the shark's cold, black eyes sent a shudder through him. "Sir? Mr. Miller?" The medic's voice snapped him back to reality. "I need you to focus. We're about to land." The helicopter was descending rapidly now, the coastline of Cape Hatteras growing larger by the second. Jack could see a crowd gathered on the hospital's helipad, medical staff ready to spring into action. As soon as the helicopter touched down, it was as if someone had hit fast forward. The door flew open, and Jack's stretcher was quickly unloaded. He squinted against the sudden brightness, the world around him a blur of movement and urgent voices. "Male, mid-40s, severe shark attack trauma to the right thigh," he heard someone rattling off. "Significant blood loss, possible signs of shock and dehydration." Jack tried to keep track of what was happening, but it was all too much. The pain, the exhaustion, the lingering terror of his ordeal. It all crashed over him like a wave. As they wheeled him into the emergency room, the last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was a familiar face pushing through the crowd. "Sarah," he whispered, and then the world went black. Jack drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of snippets of conversation and flashes of light. He heard urgent voices, felt hands working on his body, smelled the shark scent of antiseptic, but it all seemed distant, as if happening to someone else. In his mind, he was back in the water. The shark was circling, its fin cutting through the waves like a knife. Jack could feel the crushing pressure of the depths, the burning in his lungs as he fought to reach the surface. He thrashed wildly, trying to escape. Jack, honey, it's okay. You're safe now." The familiar voice cut through his nightmare like a lifeline. Jack's eyes snapped open, his heart racing. He was in a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors replacing the sound of crashing waves. And there, holding his hand, was Sarah. "Sarah," he croaked, his throat dry and raw. "You're here." "Of course I'm here, you old fool," Sarah said, her voice choked with emotion. Her eyes were red-rimmed, dark circles beneath them testament to sleepless nights. But she was smiling, a tremulous, watery smile that spoke volumes. "Where else would I be?" Jack tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his leg quickly put an end to that idea. He looked down to see his right thigh heavily bandaged, the memory of the shark's attack flooding back. "How bad is it?" he asked, dreading the answer. Sarah squeezed his hand. "The doctors say you were incredibly lucky." "The shark?" Her voice caught on the word. It missed the major arteries. "You'll need some extensive physical therapy, but they expect you to make a full recovery." Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "And the boat?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm sorry, Jack. The Sarah's Grace, she's gone." The loss of his beloved boat hit Jack harder than he expected. The Sarah's Grace had been more than just a vessel. She'd been a part of him, a symbol of the life he'd built. But as he looked at his wife, saw the love and relief in her eyes, he realized how close he'd come to losing something far more precious. "It's just a boat," he said softly. "I'm just glad to be here." Sarah leaned in, pressing her forehead against his. "When the Coast Guard called, when they said you were missing," her voice broke, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I've never been so scared in my life, Jack Miller." Jack reached up with his free hand, wincing at the movement, and cupped her cheek. "I'm sorry, love. I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you." "Damn right you should have," Sarah said, but there was no real anger in her voice, just relief, and a love so deep it made Jack's heart ache. "No more solo fishing trips, you hear me? From now on, you take Tom or one of the other guys with you." Jack nodded, too exhausted to argue. Besides, after what he'd been through, the idea of going out on the water alone held little appeal. A knock at the door interrupted their moment. A doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Miller, good to see you awake," he said, his voice warm but professional. "I'm Dr. Ramirez. How are you feeling?" "Like I went 10 rounds with a great white," Jack replied, attempting a weak smile. Dr. Ramirez chuckled. "Well, from what I hear, you're not far off. You're a very lucky man, Mr. Miller. Not many people survive an encounter like that." He proceeded to explain Jack's injuries in more detail. The deep lacerations to his thigh, the muscle and tissue damage, the risk of infection they were monitoring closely. Jack listened with a growing sense of disbelief. He'd known it was bad, but hearing it laid out so clinically brought home just how close he'd come to dying. "Now, I understand you're a fisherman," Dr. Ramirez said, his tone becoming more serious. "I want to be clear, your recovery is going to take time. We're looking at several months of physical therapy before you'll be anywhere near ready to go back out on the water." Jack nodded, a lump forming in his throat. The thought of being landlocked for months was almost as terrifying as facing the shark again. The sea was in his blood. It was all he'd ever known. As if reading his mind, Sarah squeezed his hand. "We'll get through this together," she promised. "One day at a time." Dr. Ramirez smiled at them both. You've got a good support system, Mr. Miller. That's going to be crucial in the coming months. He made a few notes on his clipboard. Now, there are a few more people who'd like to see you if you're up for it. The authorities need to take your statement about the incident. Jack sighed, suddenly feeling very tired, but he nodded. Might as well get it over with. The doctor left, and a few minutes later, 2 men entered the room. One was in a Coast Guard uniform, the other in civilian clothes but with an air of authority that marked him as some kind of official. "Mr. Miller," the Coast Guard officer said, stepping forward. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Dawson. This is Agent Reeves from the National Marine Fisheries Service. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your encounter, if you're feeling up to it." Jack nodded, steeling himself. He knew this was coming, but the thought of reliving those terrifying hours made his heart race. Sarah must have sensed his distress because she moved closer, her presence a comforting anchor. "Take your time, Mr. Miller," Agent Reeves said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "We know this must be difficult." Jack took a deep breath and began to recount his ordeal. He told them about setting out that morning, about the first sighting of the shark, the destruction of his boat. His voice shook as he described the final attack, the moment he thought it was all over. As he spoke, Jack found himself transported back to those harrowing moments. He could almost feel the cold water around him, smell the salt in the air, see those terrible black eyes bearing down on him. His heart monitor began to beat more rapidly, and he felt Sarah's hand tighten around his. "That's enough for now," Lieutenant Commander Dawson said, noticing Jack's distress. "You've been incredibly helpful, Mr. Miller. Your account will be valuable in our ongoing efforts to understand and prevent such incidents." Agent Reeves nodded in agreement. "Your experience, while traumatic, provides crucial data on shark behavior. It may help save lives in the future." As they prepared to leave, Dawson turned back. "One more thing, Mr. Miller. Your distress call, it saved your life. If you hadn't managed to get that out when you did, we might never have found you in time." Jack nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He remembered those desperate moments, shouting into the radio, praying someone would hear. After the officials left, Jack slumped back against his pillows, suddenly exhausted. Sarah stroked his arm, her touch soothing. "You did it, Jack," she said softly. "You survived. You came back to me." Jack turned to look at her, seeing the love and worry etched on her face. He thought about how close he'd come to never seeing her again, to leaving her alone. The weight of it all, the attack, the rescue, the long recovery ahead, crashed over him. For the first time since the ordeal began, Jack Miller broke down and wept. Sarah held him as the tears flowed, her own mixing with his. They cried together for the trauma endured, for the second chance granted, for the long road of recovery that lay ahead. As the sun set outside the hospital window, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jack and Sarah Miller clung to each other. The worst was over, but they both knew that the real journey, the journey of healing, both physical and emotional, was just beginning. But they would face it together, just as they had faced every challenge in their 25 years of marriage. The shark may have taken Jack's boat and nearly his life, but it had failed to take the most important thing, his spirit, and the love that had brought him home. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Sarah Miller's world came crashing down around her. She'd been up most of the night, alternating between pacing the floor of their small coastal home and staring at the phone, willing it to ring. Jack should have been home hours ago. The shrill ring of the telephone cut through the tense silence like a knife. Sarah lunged for it, her heart in her throat. "Jack?" she gasped into the receiver. "Mrs. Miller?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, professional. "This is Lieutenant Commander Dawson with the U.S. Coast Guard. I'm calling about your husband, Jack Miller." Sarah's knees buckled, and she sank onto the nearby chair. "What's happened? Is he?" She couldn't bring herself to finish the question. "Mrs. Miller, I need you to stay calm." Dawson's voice was steady, reassuring. "We received a distress call from your husband's vessel early this morning. We've initiated search and rescue operations, but I need to ask you a few questions." The next few minutes passed in a blur as Sarah answered the Coast Guard's questions. Jack's usual fishing spots, the equipment he carried, any medical conditions they should be aware of. With each question, the reality of the situation sank in deeper. As soon as she hung up, Sarah was moving. She called Tom Henderson, Jack's closest friend and fellow fisherman, her voice cracking as she relayed the news. "I'm on my way, Sarah." Tom's gruff voice was thick with concern. "We'll find him." Within the hour, the Millers' small living room had become an impromptu command center. Tom arrived with several other local fishermen, all grim-faced but determined. Maps were spread across the coffee table, marking Jack's favored fishing spots and likely drift patterns. "The Coast Guard's got their cutter out there," Tom was saying, his finger tracing paths on the map. "But we know these waters better than anyone. If Jack's out there, we'll find him." Sarah nodded, grateful for their support but terrified by the unspoken implications. If Jack was out there, the alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. As the men prepared to head out, Sarah caught Tom's arm. "Tom, there's something else," she said, her voice low. "Jack, he mentioned some shark sightings before he left. I tried to get him to stay, but..." Tom's face darkened. "Damn fool," he muttered, but there was more worry than anger in his tone. "Don't you worry, Sarah. Jack's too stubborn to let a fish get the better of him. We'll bring him home." As the impromptu search party headed out, Sarah was left alone with her thoughts and fears. She moved to the window, staring out at the ocean that had been such a constant presence in their lives. It had always been a source of life, of livelihood. Now it loomed vast and threatening, potentially hiding the most precious thing in her world. "Trees," she whispered, unsure if she was praying to God or the sea itself. "Please bring him back to me." Out on the open water, the Coast Guard cutter sliced through the waves, its crew scanning the horizon with grim determination. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Dawson studied the search grid, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Any word from the air unit?" he asked his second in command. "Negative, sir," came the reply. "They're on their third sweep now. No sign of Miller or his vessel." Dawson nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. He'd been involved in too many search and rescue operations not to know how the odds decreased with each passing hour. "Keep looking," he ordered, "and get me an update on those local boats that joined the search. Maybe they've had better luck." As if in answer to his words, the radio crackled to life. "Coast Guard, this is the Mary Ann. We found something. Aver." Dawson snatched up the receiver. "This is Lieutenant Commander Dawson. Go ahead, Mary Ann. We've spotted some debris about 15 miles east of Hatteras." The voice on the other end reported. "Looks like it could be from a small fishing boat. No sign of Miller yet, but..." "Understood." Dawson cut in. "Stay in the area. We're heading your way now." He turned to his helmsman. "Change course. Full speed." As the cutter altered its heading, Dawson allowed himself a moment of grim reflection. Debris was a sign of trouble, but it was also their first real lead. And where there was debris, there might be a survivor. "Hang on, Miller," he muttered under his breath. "We're coming." Back on shore, Sarah paced the beach, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She'd been unable to stay in the house, the walls closing in on her with each passing minute. Out here, at least she felt closer to Jack. A gentle hand on her shoulder made her jump. She turned to see Lisa, Jack's sister, standing there with concern etched on her face. "Any news?" Lisa asked softly. Sarah shook her head, blinking back tears. "Nothing yet. They found some debris, but..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Lisa pulled her into a tight embrace. "Jack's tough, you know that. If anyone can survive out there, it's him." Sarah nodded against her sister-in-law's shoulder, wanting desperately to believe it. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, marking the passage of another hour without news, hope became harder to cling to. "I can't lose him, Lisa," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't." Lisa held her tighter, her own tears falling. "You won't. We have to believe that. We have to stay strong for him." As they stood there, drawing comfort from each other, a commotion further down the beach caught their attention. A crowd was gathering, pointing out to sea. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. "What's happening?" They rushed towards the group, pushing their way through. In the distance, they could see a Coast Guard helicopter hovering low over the water. "They found something," someone in the crowd was saying. "They're lowering a diver." Sarah strained at her eyes, trying to make out what was happening. The helicopter was too far out to see clearly, but its presence alone was enough to rekindle a spark of hope. "Please," she murmured, gripping Lisa's hand tightly. "Please let it be him." Out on the water, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The Coast Guard helicopter hovered precariously close to the waves, its downdraft creating a maelstrom on the surface. And now, a lone figure bobbed in the water, Jack Miller, barely conscious but alive. Coast Guard rescue swimmer Pete Ramirez took a deep breath as he prepared to jump. He'd done this dozens of times, but each rescue came with its own set of challenges. And this one had an added complication. "Be advised," the pilot's voice crackled in his headset. "Local fishermen report increased shark activity in the area. Keep your eyes open down there." Ramirez felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean spray. "Copy that," he replied, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "I'm going in." With a final check of his gear, Ramirez leapt from the helicopter. The impact with the water was jarring, but he quickly oriented himself and began swimming towards the stranded fishermen. As he approached, Ramirez could see the extent of Miller's injuries. The man's right leg was a mess of torn flesh and congealed blood. It was a miracle he'd survived this long. "Mr. Miller," Ramirez called out as he drew near. "I'm Petty Officer Ramirez with the Coast Guard. I'm here to help you." Jack's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with pain. "The shark," she mumbled. "It's still out there." Ramirez felt a prickle of unease run down his spine. He scanned the water around them, suddenly, why acutely aware of how vulnerable they were. "Don't worry about that now, sir," he said, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "Let's focus on getting you out of here. Can you hold on to me?" Jack nodded weakly, and Ramirez moved to secure the rescue harness around him. Every second felt like an eternity, his senses hyper-aware of their exposed position. Just as he finished securing Jack, Ramirez saw a dark shape moving beneath the surface, heading straight for them. "Set," he muttered, then keyed his radio. "Control, this is Ramirez. We've got company down here. Need immediate extraction." The response was instant. "Copy that, Ramirez. Preparing to winch you up now." As the cable began to tighten, lifting them slowly from the water, Ramirez saw the shark's fin break the surface. It was massive, far larger than he'd anticipated. Come on," he urged under his breath, willing the winch to move faster. The shark circled once, twice, each pass bringing it closer. Ramirez could see its cold, black eye as it rolled to the side, sizing them up. They were only a few feet out of the water when the shark made its move. With a powerful thrust of its tail, it launched itself upward, jaws gaping. Ramirez reacted on pure instinct. He twisted in the harness, using his body to shield Jack, and kicked out hard. His foot connected solidly with the shark's snout, sending a jolt of pain up his leg. The shark fell back into the water with a tremendous splash. For a moment, Ramirez thought it was over. Then he saw the fin circling back. "Control," he shouted into his radio. "Get us up now." The winch whirred, pulling them up the last few feet. As they cleared the water, Ramirez saw the shark leap again, its massive jaws snapping shut just inches below his feet. Then they were inside the helicopter, safe. As the medical team rushed to attend to Jack, Ramirez slumped against the wall, his heart pounding. He'd had close calls before, but nothing like this. "You okay?" the pilot called back, concern evident in his voice. Ramirez nodded, still too shaken to speak. He looked down at Jack, who had finally lost consciousness. Despite everything, they'd done it. They'd beaten the odds. As the helicopter turned towards shore, Ramirez allowed himself a small smile. It had been close or too close, but they were going home. And somewhere on that shore, he knew a family would be waiting. Their prayers answered. On the beach, the crowd had grown, word spreading quickly through the small coastal community. Sarah stood at the front, her eyes never leaving the approaching helicopter. As it drew closer, she could make out two figures being lowered to the ground. One was clearly a Coast Guard member, the other, Jack. The cry tore from her throat as she recognized her husband's form, battered but alive. She rushed forward, heedless of the shouts from the Coast Guard personnel trying to maintain order. Nothing could have stopped her in that moment. As the medical team swarmed around Jack, preparing him for transport, Sarah reached his side. His eyes were closed, his skin pale beneath the tan, but his chest rose and fell with steady breaths. "Jack," she whispered, taking his hand. "I'm here. You're safe now." His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with effort. A weak smile tugged at his lips. "Sarah," she murmured, "knew you'd find me." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she bent to kiss his forehead. "Always," she promised. "I'll always find you." As the paramedics gently but firmly moved her aside to load Jack into the waiting ambulance, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see the Coast Guard swimmer who had rescued Jack. "Nam," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your husband is one hell of a fighter. It was an honor to bring him home." Sarah embraced him, her gratitude too deep for words. As she pulled back, she noticed the haunted look in the young man's eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. "Thank you," she said softly, "for risking your life to save him. I heard about the shark. Are you all right?" Ramirez managed a small smile. "I will be, ma'am. Knowing he's back with his family, that makes it all worth it." As the ambulance pulled away, sirens blaring, Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions wash over her. Relief, joy, lingering fear, and a new appreciation for the bravery of those who risked everything to save others. She looked out at the ocean, its surface now calm and innocent looking in the late afternoon sun. It had nearly taken Jack from her, but thanks to the courage and dedication of the Coast Guard and their local community, it had failed. As she turned to follow the ambulance to the hospital, Sarah sent up a silent prayer of thanks. The rescue efforts had succeeded against all odds. Now, the long journey of recovery could begin, a journey they would face together, just as they had everything else in their lives. The day's events had changed them all, leaving scars both visible and invisible. But they had survived, and in the end, that was what mattered most. The steady beep of medical equipment filled the hospital room, a constant reminder of Jack's precarious condition. It had been 3 days since his rescue, and while he was stable, the road to recovery stretched long before him. Sarah sat by his bedside, her hand gently holding his, her eyes never leaving his face. Jack stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. "Sarah?" he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "I'm here, love," Sarah said, leaning in closer. "How are you feeling?" Jack attempted a weak smile. "Like I went 10 rounds with Jaws and lost." Sarah chuckled softly, relief flooding through her at this glimpse of her husband's humor. "Well, from what I hear, you gave as good as you got." Jack's face darkened, the memory of his ordeal casting a shadow over his features. "It was close, Sarah. Too close." Before Sarah could respond, there was a gentle knock at the door. Dr. Ramirez entered, clipboard in hand and a cautious smile on his face. "Good to see you awake, Mr. Miller," he said, approaching the bed. "How's the pain today?" Jack grimaced. "Still there, but not as bad as yesterday." Dr. Ramirez nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "That's good. We're gonna start weaning you off the stronger painkillers soon. Now, if you're feeling up to it, there are some people here who'd like to speak with you." Jack and Sarah exchanged a glance. "Toh?" Jack asked. "Lieutenant Commander Dawson from the Coast Guard and Agent Reeves from the National Marine Fisheries Service," Dr. Ramirez replied. "They need to take your official statement about the incident, but only if you're feeling strong enough." Jack took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the movement. "Might as well get it over with." Dr. Ramirez nodded and stepped out. A moment later, two men entered the room. One was in a Coast Guard uniform, his bearing military precise. The other was in civilian clothes but carried himself with an air of authority. "Mr. Miller," the Coast Guard officer said, stepping forward. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Dawson. This is Agent Reeves. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us." Jack nodded, his hand tightening around Sarah's. "Of course, though I'm not sure how much help I'll be." Agent Reeves pulled up a chair, his demeanor calm and professional. "Every detail helps, Mr. Miller. We're trying to piece together exactly what happened out there. Your account could be crucial in preventing future incidents." Jack closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself. When he opened them again, there was a determination in his gaze. "All right, where do you want me to start?" "From the beginning," Dawson said gently. "Take us through that morning." Jack took a deep breath and began his tale. He described the calm morning, the uneasy feeling that had plagued him as he set out. His voice grew tense as he recounted the first sighting of the shark. "It was bigger than anything I'd ever seen," Jack said, his eyes distant. "And first, I thought it was just passing through. But then..." He described the initial attack on his boat, the terrifying moments as the Sarah's Grace began to sink. Sarah's grip on his hand tightened as he spoke of falling into the water, of the heart-stopping terror as he realized he was now in the shark's domain. "I tried to stay calm," Jack continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remembered reading somewhere that panicking would only attract it more. But when I saw it coming straight for me..." Jack's voice trailed off, his face pale with the memory. Sarah leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "It's okay, love. You're safe now." Agent Reeves leaned forward, his pen poised over his notepad. "Can you describe the shark's behavior, Mr. Miller? Was it acting aggressively from the start, or did something seem to trigger its attacks?" Jack furrowed his brow, thinking back. "It was methodical, like it was sizing me up. It circled for a while before the first real attack. And even then, it was like it was testing me." "Testing you?" Dawson asked, his interest piqued. Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, it would make these passes, getting closer each time. I think it was trying to wear me down." Reeves made a note, his expression thoughtful. "That's consistent with other accounts we've heard. These animals are far more intelligent than most people realize." Jack continued his story, describing the relentless attacks, the desperate struggle to stay afloat and fend off the massive predator. His voice grew hoarse as he recounted the final, terrifying moments before his rescue. "I thought that was it," he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I could see it coming, this massive shape in the water. I knew I didn't have the strength for another fight. And then the Coast Guard arrived," Dawson finished softly. Jack nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "If they'd been a minute later..." Sarah squeezed his hand, her own eyes wet. "But they weren't. You made it, Jack. You survived." There was a moment of heavy silence in the room. Then Reeves cleared his throat, his pen scratching across his notepad. "Mr. Miller, your account is invaluable. The details you've provided about the shark's behavior, its size and appearance, it'll help us better understand these creatures and how to mitigate human-shark conflicts in the future." Jack managed a weak smile. "Glad some good can come out of this mess." Dawson stood, straightening his uniform. "We can't thank you enough for your cooperation, Mr. Miller, your bravery out there, and your willingness to share your experience. It's going to save lives." As the two men prepared to leave, Jack called out, "Wait!" They turned back, eyebrows raised. "The shark," Jack said, his voice steady. "What happened to it?" Reeves and Dawson exchanged a glance. "We're not entirely sure," Reeves admitted. "There have been no further sightings since your rescue. It's possible it's moved on to deeper waters." Jack nodded slowly, a complex mix of emotions crossing his face. "Can't," he said finally. "It was just doing what comes naturally, I suppose. Doesn't mean I ever want to see it again, though." After Dawson and Reeves left, Jack slumped back against his pillows, clearly drained by the ordeal of reliving his experience. Sarah stroked his arm gently, her touch soothing. "You did great, love," she murmured. "I'm so proud of you." Jack turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she'd rarely seen in her strong, capable husband. "I keep seeing it, Sarah," he whispered. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that water. I can feel it circling, waiting." Sarah climbed onto the bed beside him, careful of his injuries, and wrapped her arms around him. "I know, sweetheart. I know. But you're safe now. We'll get through this together, just like we always have." As Jack leaned into her embrace, letting out a shaky breath, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was Pete Ramirez, the Coast Guard swimmer who had rescued Jack. "Sorry to interrupt," Ramirez said, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I just wanted to check in, see how you were doing." Jack managed a genuine smile. "Thanks to you, I'm still breathing. Come in, please." Ramirez entered, standing awkwardly at the foot of the bed. "I'm glad to see you're recovering, sir. That was, well, it was one hell of a rescue." "I hear you had quite the close call yourself," Jack said, his eyes searching the younger man's face. Ramirez nodded, a haunted look passing over his features. "Yeah, I've never seen anything like it. The way it came at us at the end there." He shuddered slightly. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked gently, recognizing the signs of trauma she'd seen in her husband's eyes. Ramirez seemed startled by the question. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's part of the job, you know?" But Jack wasn't buying it. "Son, there's nothing part of the job about what we went through out there. It's okay to be shaken up." Ramirez's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "It's just, I keep thinking about what could have happened. If I'd been a second slower, if the winch had jammed." "But it didn't," Jack said firmly. "You did your job and you did it damn well. We both made it out alive because of you." Ramirez nodded, blinking rapidly. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." As Ramirez turned to leave, Jack called out, "Pete." The swimmer turned back. "If you ever need to talk, well, I reckon we're the only two people who really know what happened out there. My door's always open." Ramirez smiled, a genuine expression that seemed to lift some of the weight from his shoulders. "I appreciate that, Mr. Miller. I really do." After Ramirez left, Jack turned to Sarah, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," he said slowly, "I think I understand now why my dad always said the sea demands respect." Sarah nodded, running her fingers gently through his hair. "It's a powerful force. But so are we," Jack said, a hint of his old determination creeping back into his voice. "We're survivors, Sarah. Both of us. And we're going to get through this. Just like we've gotten through everything else life's thrown our way." As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jack and Sarah Miller held each other close. They both knew that the road ahead would be challenging. There would be nightmares, moments of doubt, a long process of physical and emotional healing. But they also knew that they had each other, and a strength forged by years of love and shared experiences. The shark may have taken Jack's boat and nearly his life, but it had failed to break his spirit. And in the warmth of his wife's embrace, Jack found the courage to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The final stand against the shark was over. Now, the journey of recovery and renewal could truly begin. The relentless sun beat down on the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, its rays penetrating the water's surface and illuminating the nightmarish scene unfolding beneath. Jack Miller, battered and exhausted, clung desperately to a piece of debris from his destroyed boat, the Sarah's grace. His right leg, a mangled mess of torn flesh and muscle, trailed in the water behind him, a constant source of searing pain that threatened to overwhelm his senses. For what felt like an eternity, Jack had been locked in a deadly dance with a monstrous tiger shark, a behemoth that dwarfed any he had encountered in his decades as a fisherman. The predator circled him now, its dorsal fins slicing through the water with ominous intent. Jack's eyes, bloodshot and stinging from the salt water, never left that fin, knowing that the moment he lost sight of it could be his last. "Come on," Jack muttered through cracked, bleeding lips. "Someone has to be looking by now." As if in response to his desperate plea, a distant sound caught his attention. At first, he thought it was a hallucination, a trick of his exhausted mind. But as it grew louder, hope surged through him with a force that was almost painful. The steady whump, whump, whump of helicopter blades cut through the air, growing louder with each passing second. Jack's heart raced as he scanned the horizon, praying that his ears weren't deceiving him. Then he saw it, a small dark speck in the distance, rapidly growing larger. A Coast Guard helicopter was approaching, its orange and white paint scheme a beacon of hope against the endless blue of sky and sea. "Here!" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse and barely audible even to his own ears. He waved his arms frantically, ignoring the protest of his battered muscles. "I'm here!" The shark, disturbed by the noise and commotion, circled closer. Its cold, black eye rolled to the side as it passed, regarding Jack with ancient, implacable hunger. Jack could see the scars that crisscrossed its gray hide, testament to a lifetime of battles won. The sight sent a chill down his spine, a stark reminder of how precarious his situation remained, even with rescue so close at hand. As the helicopter drew nearer, Jack could make out a figure in the open door, scanning the water. His heart leapt as the aircraft began to lower, hovering about 50 feet above the waves. "Please see me," Jack whispered, his eyes darting between the approaching helicopter and the ever-present fins circling ever closer. Suddenly, the water around him exploded into a maelstrom of spray and churning foam as the helicopter's downdraft hit the surface. Jack was momentarily blinded, sputtering as he was buffeted by the wind and water. When he managed to clear his vision, he saw a figure descending rapidly on a thin cable. The Coast Guard rescue swimmer, clad in a bright orange suit, hit the water about 20 yards away and immediately began swimming towards Jack with powerful strokes. Relief flooded through Jack, so intense it was almost painful, but it was short-lived. As the swimmer approached, Jack saw the shark's fin change course, heading directly for the rescuer. "Behind you," Jack shouted, his voice cracking with the effort. "Shark!" The rescue swimmer, alerted by Jack's warning, glanced over his shoulder. Seeing the approaching fin, he increased his pace, eating up the distance between them with smooth, practiced movements. "Sir," the swimmer called out as he drew near, "I'm Petty Officer Ramirez. I'm here to get you out of here. Are you injured?" Jack nodded weakly, gesturing to his mangled leg. "Shark got me good. Been circling ever since." Ramirez's eyes widened as he took in the extent of Jack's injuries, but his voice remained calm and professional. "Understood. I'm gonna secure you to me, and we're going to get you out of here. Just hold on." As Ramirez worked to secure the rescue harness around Jack, the shark made its move. With a powerful thrust of its tail, it surged forward, its massive jaws opening wide. "Look out!" Jack yelled, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Ramirez spun in the water, coming face to face with the approaching predator. In a move born of training and pure instinct, he lashed out with his rescue can, striking the shark squarely on its sensitive snout. The impact sent a shudder through the massive creature. It veered off at the last second, its huge body brushing past them with enough force to spin them in the water. "Jesus," Ramirez breathed, his calm demeanor cracking slightly. He keyed his radio, his voice urgent. "Control, this is Ramirez. We've got an active shark down here. Need immediate extraction. The response was instant. Copy that, Ramirez. Preparing to winch you up now. As the cable began to tighten, lifting them slowly fro. The water. Jack saw the shark's fin break the surface once more. It was circling back, undeterred by its earlier rebuff. It's coming back, Jack warned, his voice tight with fear. Ramirez nodded grimly. Just hold on, sir. We're almost out of here. The next few moments were a blur of terror and desperate hope for Jack. The shark circled them as they were lifted, each pass bringing it closer. Jack could see its cold, black eye as it rolled to the side, sizing them up. They were only a few feet out of the water when the shark made its final, terrifying lunge. With a powerful thrust of its tail, it launched itself upward, jaws gaping wide to reveal rows of serrated teeth. Time seemed to slow for Jack. He could see every detail of the massive predator, the scars on its hide, the small fish attached to its skin, the dead, soulless look in its eye. In that moment, Jack was certain that this was the end. After everything he'd been through, he was going to die within sight of his rescuers. But Ramirez wasn't done fighting. With a move that spoke of incredible training and raw courage, he twisted in the harness, using his body to shield Jack. His foot shot out, connecting solidly with the shark's snout just as its jaws were about to close around them. The impact sent a shock through the entire rescue harness. Jack heard Ramirez grunt in pain, but the swimmer's grip on him never loosened. The shark fell back into the water with a tremendous splash, momentarily stunned by the unexpected blow. "Now, pull us up now," Ramirez shouted into his radio. The winch whirred to life, pulling them up the last few feet with agonizing slowness. As they cleared the water, Jack saw the shark leap once more, its massive jaws snapping shut just inches below Ramirez's feet. And then they were inside the helicopter, safe. Jack collapsed onto the floor, his body shaking uncontrollably as the full weight of what he'd just survived crashed over him. Medical personnel swarmed around him, their voices a blur of technical jargon and urgent commands. "BP's dropping. Start in 4, wide open. We need to get this leg stabilized now." Through the haze of pain and encroaching unconsciousness, Jack sought out Ramirez. The swimmer was slumped against the far wall of the helicopter, his face pale and drawn. "Thank you," Jack managed to croak out before the darkness claimed him. As Jack drifted in and out of consciousness during the flight to the hospital, fragments of memory flashed through his mind. The calm morning as he'd set out on the Sarah's Grace. Sarah's worried face as she'd asked him not to go. The first, terrifying sight of the shark's fin cutting through the water. The long, agonizing hours of struggle and fear. He became aware of a commotion around him as the helicopter landed. There were more voices, the sensation of movement as he was transferred to a gurney. Through half-lidded eyes, he caught glimpses of the organized chaos of an emergency room. Nail, mid-40s, severe shark attack trauma to the right thigh, someone was saying. Significant blood loss, signs of hypovolemic shock. "Or2 is prepped and standing by," came another voice. As they wheeled him through the hospital corridors, a familiar voice cut through the fog of Jack's consciousness. "Jack. Oh God, Jack. Sarah." As Sarah was here, with monumental effort, Jack forced his eyes open. There she was, running alongside his gurney, her face a mask of fear and relief. Sarah," he managed to whisper. She grabbed his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'm here, love. You're safe now. You're going to be okay." A doctor gently but firmly moved Sarah aside as they reached a set of swinging doors. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you can't go any further. We need to get him into surgery immediately." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I love you, Jack," she called out as the doors swung shut between them. "I'll be right here waiting for you." The next several hours passed in a blur for Jack. He was only vaguely aware of the surgical team working to save his leg, their voices a distant murmur as they fought to repair the damage done by the shark's powerful jaws. When he finally regained full consciousness, The first thing Jack became aware of was the steady beep of a heart monitor. He blinked slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of what he realized was a hospital room. "Jack, can you hear me, love?" Sarah's voice, soft and filled with concern, drew his attention. He turned his head to see her sitting beside his bed, her hand gently holding his. "Sarah," he croaked, his throat dry and raw. Relief washed over her face. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I was so worried. How are you feeling?" Jack took a moment to assess himself. His entire body ached, and there was a dull, throbbing pain in his right leg. But he was alive. Against all odds, he had survived. "Like I've been through a meat grinder," he said with a weak attempt at a smile. "But I'm here." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You nearly weren't, Jack. When the Coast Guard called to say you were missing." Her voice broke. "I've never been so scared in my life." Jack squeezed her hand, ignoring the protest of his battered muscles. "I'm sorry, love. I should have listened to you. Should never have gone out alone." Before Sarah could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. A doctor entered, his face serious but not unkind. "Mr. Miller, good to see you awake. I'm Dr. Ramirez. How are you feeling?" Jack managed a wry smile. "Like I've had a disagreement with a very large fish." Dr. Ramirez chuckled. "Well, that's one way to put it. You're a very lucky man, Mr. Miller. The damage to your leg was extensive, but we were able to save it. You're looking at a long recovery, but with physical therapy, we expect you to regain most, if not all, of your mobility." Jack nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you, document, for everything." As Dr. Ramirez explained the details of Jack's injuries and the road to recovery ahead, Jack found his mind drifting back to those terrifying hours in the water. The memory of the shark's cold, black eye still sent a shiver down his spine. "Doc," Jack interrupted, his voice low. "The shark, what happened to it?" Dr. Ramirez paused, exchanging a glance with Sarah. "I'm afraid I don't have that information, Mr. Miller. Perhaps the Coast Guard or Marine Fisheries Service might know more." Jack nodded, a complex mix of emotions washing over him. Part of him hoped the shark had been caught or killed, putting an end to the threat it posed. But another part, the part that had spent a lifetime on the water and understood the delicate balance of nature, hoped it had simply returned to the depths. As if summoned by his thoughts, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was Lieutenant Commander Dawson from the Coast Guard, accompanied by a man in civilian clothes who introduced himself as Agent Reeves from the National Marine Fisheries Service. "Mr. Miller," Dawson said, his voice respectful, "we're glad to see you recovering. When you're feeling up to it, we'd like to get your full statement about what happened out there." Jack nodded slowly. "Of course, anything I can do to help." Reeves stepped forward, his expression grave. "Mr. Miller, your experience, while traumatic, provides invaluable data on shark behavior. The information you can provide could help prevent future incidents and save lives." As Jack recounted his ordeal, from the first sighting of the shark to the dramatic rescue, he found himself reliving every terrifying moment. Sarah held his hand throughout, her presence a comforting anchor. When he finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. Dawson cleared his throat. "That's quite a tale of survival, Mr. Miller. Your courage out there was extraordinary." Jack shook his head. "I just did what I had to do to stay alive. The real heroes are the Coast Guard team that pulled me out of there." Reeves nodded, making notes on his pad. "One last question, Mr. Miller. In your professional opinion as an experienced fisherman, what do you think provoked the shark's aggressive behavior?" Jack was quiet for a moment, considering. "Honestly, I don't think anything provoked it. That shark, it was just doing what sharks do. It's their ocean, after all. We're the visitors." As Dawson and Reeves prepared to leave, Jack called out, "Wait." They turned back, eyebrows raised. "The shark," Jack said, his voice steady. "What happened to it?" The two men exchanged a glance. "We're not entirely sure," Reeves admitted. There have been no further sightings since your rescue. It's possible it's moved on to deeper waters. Jack nodded slowly, a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying lifting from his shoulders. Good, he said finally. I hope it stays out there, where it belongs. After they left, Jack turned to Sarah, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. I keep seeing it, Sarah, he whispered. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that water. Sarah climbed onto the bed beside him, careful of his injuries, and wrapped her arms around him. I know, love, I know, but you're safe now. We'll get through this together, just like we always have. As Jack leaned into her embrace, letting out a shaky breath, he knew that the road ahead would be challenging. There would be physical therapy, nightmares, moments of doubt. But he had survived. Against all odds, he had faced one of nature's most perfect predators and lived to tell the tale. The sun was setting outside the hospital window, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. As Jack watched the day fade, he felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. He was alive. He was with the woman he loved. And somehow, someway, he would find a way to make peace with the ocean once more. The shark may have taken his boat and nearly his life, but it had failed to break his spirit. And in the warmth of his wife's embrace, Jack found the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Salvation had come, not just in the form of a Coast Guard helicopter, but in the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome, to survive, and to find hope even in the darkest of waters. The early morning sunlight filtered through the hospital room window, casting a warm glow across Jack Miller's bed. It had been 2 weeks since his harrowing rescue from the jaws of death in the Atlantic, and today marked a significant milestone in his recovery. He was finally being discharged. Jack sat on the edge of the bed, his calloused hands gripping the sheets as he stared down at his right leg. The doctors had done an incredible job, but the evidence of his encounter with the tiger shark was impossible to ignore. A network of angry red scars crisscrossed his thigh, a permanent reminder of how close he'd come to losing not just his leg, but his life. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. Sarah entered, her face a mixture of excitement and concern. "Ready to go home, sailor?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jack managed a small smile. "As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose." Sarah crossed the room, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "One step at a time, remember? That's what Dr. Ramirez said." Jack nodded, taking a deep breath. With Sarah's help, he carefully stood, testing his weight on his injured leg. The pain was there, a constant throb, but it was manageable. He took a tentative step, then another, leaning heavily on the cane the physical therapist had provided. "Look at you," Sarah beamed, pride evident in her voice. "My strong, stubborn fisherman." Jack chuckled, the sound a bit strained but genuine. "Stubborn is right. It'll take more than an overgrown fish to keep me down." As they made their way out of the hospital, Jack was struck by how different the world seemed. The colors appeared more vivid, the air sweeter. He'd always heard people talk about near-death experiences changing their perspective, but he'd never truly understood until now. The drive home was quiet, both Jack and Sarah lost in their thoughts. As they pulled up to their modest coastal home, Jack felt a lump form in his throat. The sight of the familiar weathered siding and the small garden Sarah tended so lovingly had never been more welcome. "Home sweet home," Sarah said softly, squeezing his hand. Jack nodded, unable to speak past the emotions welling up inside him. With Sarah's help, he made his way up the front steps and into the house. The living room was exactly as he remembered it, but something felt different. It took him a moment to realize what it was. The ever-present scent of salt and fish that usually clung to him was gone, replaced by the sterile smell of the hospital. As Jack settled into his favorite armchair, Sarah busied herself in the kitchen, preparing a light lunch. The normalcy of it all felt surreal after the chaos of the past 2 weeks. "Jack," Sarah called from the kitchen. "Tom called earlier. He and some of the other fishermen want to stop by later if you're feeling up to it." Jack hesitated, The thought of facing his fellow fishermen, of recounting his ordeal yet again, made his stomach churn. But he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. "Sure," he called back, trying to keep his voice steady. "That'd be fine." As the afternoon wore on, Jack found himself growing restless. He stood carefully, making his way to the large bay window that overlooked the ocean. The water stretched out before him, calm and inviting in the late afternoon sun. But as he gazed out at the horizon, Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Somewhere out there, the shark that had nearly taken his life was still swimming, still hunting. The sound of vehicles pulling up outside broke Jack from his reverie. He turned to see several trucks parking in front of the house, familiar faces emerging. Tom Henderson was the first to the door, his weathered face breaking into a wide grin as Sarah let him in. "Jack, you old sea dog," Tom boomed, crossing the room in a few quick strides. He pulled up short, clearly unsure whether to go for his usual bear hug. "Damn, it's good to see you up and about." Jack managed a smile, extending his hand. Tom took it, gripping it firmly. "Good to be seen, Tom. Thanks for coming by." The other fishermen filed in: Mike, Dave, and Old Joe. Each greeted Jack warmly, their relief at seeing him alive and recovering evident in their faces. As they settled in the living room, an awkward silence fell. Jack could see the questions in their eyes, the burning curiosity to hear about his encounter firsthand. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "All right, fellas," he said, his voice gruff. "I know you're all dying to ask, so go ahead." The questions came in a flood then. What had it been like? How big was the shark really? Did he think it was still out there? Jack answered as best he could, trying to keep his voice steady as he recounted the terrifying hours he'd spent in the water. "I've been fishing these waters for 40 years, Old Joe said, shaking his head in wonder. "Never seen anything like what you're describing, Jack. You're one lucky son of a gun." Jack nodded, his hand unconsciously moving to rub his injured leg. "Lucky's one word for it, I suppose." Tom leaned forward, his expression serious. "Jack, we've all been talking. The Sarah's Grace. Well, she's gone. But we want to help you get back on the water when you're ready. We're putting together a fund to help you get a new boat." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. The loss of his beloved boat had been a constant ache, almost as painful as his physical injuries. "You boys don't have to do that," he managed to say. Mike spoke up, his usually quiet voice firm. "We want to, Jack. You're one of us, and we take care of our own." The conversation turned then to lighter topics: local gossip, plans for the upcoming fishing season. But Jack found it hard to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the ocean, to the moment when he'd locked eyes with the shark. He shuddered, trying to shake off the memory. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room, the fishermen began to take their leave. Each clasped Jack's hand firmly, offering words of encouragement and support. Tom was the last to go, lingering at the door. "Jack," he said, his voice low, "I know that look in your eye. You're scared to go back out there, and that's okay. But don't let it beat you. You're stronger than that shark. You hear me?" Jack nodded, grateful for his friend's understanding. "Thanks, Tom, for everything." After the last truck had pulled away, Sarah came to stand beside Jack at the window. She wrapped an arm around his waist, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You okay?" she asked softly. Jack was quiet for a long moment, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the ocean in shades of gold and pink. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I keep thinking about what Tom said, about not letting it beat me. But Sarah, I'm not sure I can ever go back out there." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "Jack Miller, I've known you for 30 years. You're the strongest, bravest man I've ever met. If anyone can overcome this, it's you. But if you decide you can't, if you want to walk away from fishing for good, I support you, no matter what." Jack pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "What did I do to deserve you?" he murmured, As night fell, Jack found sleep elusive. He tossed and turned, his injured leg aching, his mind replaying the attack in vivid detail. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he carefully got out of bed, trying not to wake Sarah. He made his way to the living room, easing himself into his armchair. The full moon outside cast a silvery glow across the water, creating an almost ethereal scene. Jack stared out at the ocean, feeling a complex mix of fear, longing, and uncertainty. The soft pad of footsteps alerted him to Sarah's presence. She appeared in the doorway, wrapping her robe tightly around herself. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. Jack shook his head. "Keep seeing it. Every time I close my eyes." Sarah crossed the room, perching on the arm of his chair. "Have you thought about talking to someone? Dr. Ramirez mentioned a support group for trauma survivors." Jack snorted. "A support group? Come on, Sarah. I'm not some delicate flower. I've faced storms that would make most men quake in their boots. I can handle this." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't about being strong or weak, Jack. It's about healing. Not just your body, but your mind too." Jack was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe you're right. I'll think about it." As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, Jack made a decision. Slowly, carefully, he stood and made his way to the front door. Sarah followed, a question in her eyes. "I need to do this," Jack said softly, answering her unspoken query. Together, they stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and crisp, heavy with the scent of salt and seaweed. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pull of the ocean. Leaning heavily on his cane, Jack made his way down the weathered wooden steps and onto the sandy path that led to the beach. Each step was a struggle, his injured leg protesting the uneven terrain, but he pressed on, driven by a need he couldn't quite articulate. As they crested the small dune that separated their property from the public beach, the vast expanse of the Atlantic spread out before them. The water was calm, painted in shades of pink and gold by the rising sun. Jack stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The beauty of it was undeniable, but so was the surge of fear that rose up within him. His hand tightened on the cane, knuckles turning white. Sarah's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his. "It's okay," she murmured. "I'm right here." Slowly, painfully, Jack made his way down to the water's edge. The cold water lapped at his bare feet, a sensation that had once been as natural to him as breathing. Now it sent a shiver of apprehension through him. He stood there, the waves gently breaking around his ankles, staring out at the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond where the eye could see, lay the site of his near-death experience. The place where he'd come face to face with one of nature's most perfect predators and, against all odds, survived. "I don't know if I can do it, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can go back out there." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You don't have to decide right now. You've got time, Jack. Time to heal, time to process what happened. And whatever you decide, I'll be right here beside you." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jack felt something shift within him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of his stomach. But alongside it, he felt something else stirring, a familiar restlessness, a longing for the open water that had been a part of him for as long as he could remember. He turned to Sarah, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You know what? I think I will go to that support group. And then, well, we'll see." Sarah smiled back, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "One step at a time, remember?" Jack nodded, taking one last look at the vast ocean before them. The shark was still out there somewhere, a force of nature as ancient and unstoppable as the tides themselves. But Jack was still here, too battered and scarred, but unbowed. As they made their way back up the beach, Jack's steps were a little steadier, his grip on the cane a little less desperate. The road ahead would be long and challenging, filled with setbacks and moments of doubt. But with Sarah by his side and the support of his community behind him, Jack knew he could face whatever came next. The shark had taken his boat, nearly taken his life, and left him with scars both physical and emotional. But it hadn't taken his spirit, and as the new day dawned, bright with possibility, Jack Miller found himself ready to face the next chapter of his life, whatever it might bring.